My name is Dr. Ronan Foley. I'm a lecturer in the Geography department in Maynooth University, and my particular area of interest is in places that are associated with health in nature. One of the things I'm really interested in, and one of the things that Leitrim is particularly famous for, are sweathouses. So this is a sweathouse. This is the sweathouse at Killadiscart townland, about halfway between Drumkeeran and Dowra. And this is one of the best preserved examples of a sweathouse left in the current age. Sweathouses are really interesting features of the landscape, and they're pretty unique to Leitrim, though not exclusive to Leitrim. You can find them they're clustered around this part of Ireland, particularly East Sligo, North Roscommon, Cavan and South Fermanagh, but they're actually dotted around the country. But this is the part of the world where they're best preserved and best visited. They're very mysterious things in that people don't really know a huge amount about them. There's very little evidence of how old they are. There's a bit of evidence about when they were probably most widely used, and we kind of know when they stopped being used, but they remain here like this as a really interesting heritage feature of the landscape, and they have a really interesting cultural history as well. So we don't know when they started. There's lots of fanciful ideas that they were brought here by the Vikings, that they brought this idea of a kind of a Scandinavian sweathouse or a sauna to Ireland when they were here in the 9th and 10th century. Other people suggest they were brought back from Irish people who went to North America and brought back the idea of the sweat lodge. But ultimately, they seem to me to be a kind of unique, locally created variant of a sort of a sweat cure or of a sort of version of a sauna. So those cultures exist all over the world, and here we have a very unique, very local variant of if you like, the sauna cure or the sauna treatment. So as you can see here from this good remaining example in Killadiscart, they basically look like stone igloos. You can see them on it. You can see the shape of it. It's kind of shaped like an igloo. It's built from stone, and it's local limestone here locally, so it's easily cut. So it's stone, turf sods. Again, turf is pretty plentiful locally, and they're wedged together. Sometimes they use a bit of clay as the kind of to wedge the stones together, but more often than not they're dry stone built. So again, they're a really interesting example of dry stone work in the landscape. And this particular version is kind of quite tall, but again a fairly typical shape, so it's slightly elongated, but typically they're either circular or slightly oval shaped. This example here is about 2.2 meters in height from the outside, and about 1.9 meters high on the inside, so just about tall enough to take a fairly tall person fitting inside. But again, most people would have lied down when they were in the sweathouse. About the same width across. What you can see here at the front is a very small entrance hole, so this is like your kind of igloo entrance. So you go in here, it's about, I think it's 45 centimeters in height, and you basically crawled in there. This was closed up, so the actual entrance was then closed up, and you had the treatment. So how it worked was that for a couple of hours before, sometimes for half a day, it was quite a labour-intensive process. People would burn turf inside, so they'd put turf inside, seal this up, seal the hole at the top, and we'll maybe go and have a look at that in a minute, but there's a hole at the top for letting the air and the steam out, and air in and out. And they would heat up the stones on the inside. So basically the inside is also this dry stone structure. And then once it was sufficiently heated, the people who wanted to get the sweathouse treatment would go in, they'd take their clothes off, usually went in naked. And this door was sealed up. The heat at the hole at the top was sealed up to keep the heat in and the steam in. And then you would just sit there for maybe 20-30 minutes, sweat out your impurities, and when you were ready, you'd come out. There's lots of kind of stories of young kids impishly stealing people's clothes, which were left in a pile at the door, when they were inside, and people coming out and having to find their clothes. But typically, people would go in, usually be a couple of women or a couple of men. The only people who'd go in mixed gender would be a husband and wife. So that was the treatment. People use them for a range of different cures, but like a lot of sweat cures around the world, they were mostly for rheumatism, for arthritis, for colds and fevers, and for some respiratory illnesses as well. So this was well documented that this is what they were used for locally. So there's some really good evidence from the 1930s schools collection in Ireland with local testimonies and local oral histories about what the individual Leitrim sweathouses were used for and who used them, and indeed who even built them. So we know a little bit from the schools collection about that. The schools collection is a great source specifically for local Leitrim knowledge. So how the schools collection worked was that in the 1930s, collectors were sent out all over the country to gather up oral history testimonies from local schools, and they got local school kids to go out and interview their grandparents and older people in the area to essentially collect up all the folklore and stories from the late 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. My own mother actually was one of the kids who wrote up the report in the 1930s. And what people were asked about was they were asked to collect information on things like cures as well. So the sweathouses are talked about as a particular topic in the schools collection. So you'll find information specifically on sweathouses, not just for Leitrim County, but for other counties they were found in as well. And they also record things like folk cures. So in a way you could see the sweathouse as a kind of a variant of a folk cure. And I mentioned the specific kind of treatments they were for. Really, they were for colds and fevers, rheumatism, arthritis, and some respiratory problems. Anyone could use them, and I think they were often used by fairly able-bodied people. So it was important to be able to work the land up here, and important to be healthy and fit. So if you were struggling a bit with respiratory disease, or you had a really bad fever, you wanted to get rid of it as quick as you could, so you could carry on working, really. So they were kind of a form of occupational health, if you like, as well. What's interesting in some of the other counties, and there's no evidence for it in Leitrim, but in Monaghan there's records of a kind of a bath master, an itinerant bath master who would go around and check people before they went into sweathouses. For example, sweating cures are not good for people who are very overweight or have heart conditions, so this particular person's job was to kind of check that. But I think more commonly they were just used by people as and when they felt they needed them. A very interesting testimony from a townland over near Drumshambo about a family called Lynch who actually bled people, as in a kind of they're basically saying people would go into a sweathouse, and if the sweating cure didn't work, they would take some blood from them or bled them. So there's a testimony there of a Lynch family near Drumshambo who were really good at bleeding people. So it's kind of a very interesting example from the testimony. Other testimony also talks about when they were built, which is really interesting. So in those schools collections, older people are talking about remembering in the 1880s that their parents had taught them they were built by so-and-so, and they were built on this land in the 1820s, 1830s. So they were still being built at that time. So they certainly, you can begin to date a little bit of the more recent ones. So again, I don't think they were all built in one go. They were kind of built over time, and people, I guess, copied one another and did it like that. The only carbon dating that's been done on any of the stones for a sweathouse was done in Northern Ireland, and they estimate that the oldest stones in the sweathouse that they found up there was from around 1600. So they're not, evidence suggests they're not really old. The other evidence we have of their widespread use comes from travellers' accounts. So in the kind of 17th and particularly in the 18th century, lots of foreign travellers, British travellers or European travellers would drive around Ireland to do a kind of fairly fixed circuit and record what they saw as they moved around. And a number of those travellers were really taken by sweathouses. A French traveller called de la Cottney, I think was his name, came over in around the 1790s and wrote extensively about sweathouses and the ones he saw, and he was curious about what he called the Irish hot air bath. So it's kind of really interesting idea of a name as well. I've mapped them, and I've taken the map of the locations of the wells, and I've also overlaid it with things like geology and soil and topography. So they're nearly all on sort of limestone geology, nearly all on kind of clay, boggy soils, actually called Drumkieran soil. And they're all between about 100 and 300 metres in altitude. So they're kind of upland features in a particular type of soil. And as is the case, there seems to be a relationship between where they were built and the local materials and what they're constructed from. So you can see here you've got a mix of sod and stone and moss, and some of the clay was used to seal the gaps between them. It's important to seal those gaps as well, because you want to keep as much air in there as physically possible. The other part of a treatment that was important in some sweathouses, and I don't see much evidence of it here, it's pretty boggy all around the sweathouse, but quite often you'd have a stream or a little plunge pool near them. So again, it's that classic sort of sauna type cure almost, where you get hot, you cool down, you get hot, you cool down. They didn't quite work the same way as a sauna or a Turkish bath would, in that you didn't go in and out all the time. You tended to have one visit only. But you would come out and go to a plunge pool, wrap up really warm and go home. And there's plenty of evidence to say that if people didn't wrap themselves up properly afterwards and get themselves off to a warm bed for a few hours, that they would suffer, and they would suffer the consequences, and the cold would get worse. An obvious question would be, they must have been very smoky inside if you've had like 2 days of turf piling away in there and burning away in there, half a day's turf. And that's what the entrance hole at the top was for, and the entrance was for as well. They were sealed up while they were being heated, and they were taken out when you wanted to use it. So the heat was preserved, the smoke was let out. And as I said, some people like to sometimes put rushes along the bottom, and rushes would create a kind of a steam, so they would sort of steam rather than smoke. So unlike the turf, they were kind of nicer in terms of your actual treatment inside. So you actually got a sense of what you'd imagine a contemporary steam room to be like a little bit as well. So there's this kind of combined sauna steam room effect. So they were pretty widely used, we understand, probably in the 17th, 18th centuries and through the early 19th centuries. And then from oral histories from the school's collection, from other evidence, it seems as if their regular use died out a lot in the mid to late 19th century. And there's very little evidence of sweathouses being in action beyond 1900. There's a couple of the testimonies in Leitrim that suggest that some of them were still being used in the 1910s and 1920s, but really they'd gone out of fashion and use in the later 19th century. It's hard to know why. I think one reason probably is that the first kind of rural doctors and rural GPs came in around that time, and there was the first network of kind of medical support, primary medical care support in very rural areas like this, and that people were able to kind of go to the dispensary or go to the local doctor and get cures that way, I guess. So from a heritage point of view, I think these are fascinating. There's a really interesting potential with the sweathouses in Leitrim in particular. Leitrim is pretty unique in that I think it has probably, there's 97 sweathouses documented as being in Leitrim, of which around 50 are left in some form or other. And of that 50, about, I think it's 22 might be argued to be in reasonably good condition, and this is one of the best of them. Another 10 or so are in halfway decent condition, and then the other ones that are visible are mostly remnants, piles of stones. So it's a heritage asset that's been lost very quickly. And I was here in 2008. Another visitor took a picture here in the 1990s. So that's a 30-year period, and it's kept up pretty well. It's in reasonably good nick. But these are things that are not going to stay up forever. And I think some sort of, maybe certainly an effort to document them would be really helpful, to list them in a database, to list their condition, to update the existing records that are there. I think the other really interesting thing that might be a great heritage project would be to rebuild one, to actually kind of go and look at the records, look at how this one was built, maybe get some local communities involved, some engineers, some designers and architects, and actually rebuild one somewhere and keep it as a kind of permanent feature of the heritage. I think that would be a real asset to the local area.